So Mike, can you tell us a little bit about the beginnings of Pottstown?
Well, the beginnings of Pottstown happened because the founder, John Potts, found out that he was not going to inherit his father's home outside of Boyertown, Pennsylvania. So he was looking for some place to call his own, and so he bought 696 acres from the family by the name of McCall. It's pretty nice. You know you're doing pretty well when you can buy 696 acres because you're not going to inherit your father's house. And the land that we're talking about is right along the Manatawny Creek and the Schuylkill River, right down to the mouth of the Manatawny Creek. When he came here, there wasn't much here. There was a mill, a grist mill, which we now know as Pottstown Roller Mills, and there might have been an iron forge on the property. And so Potts came here, built his magnificent Pottsgrove mansion there in 1752, and the family moved in. And at this point, it was actually geographically was a great location for him because it put him a lot closer to his business interests in northern Chester County. Now, a lot of people are under the, for want of a better word, the misapprehension that Pottstown was founded in 1752. It was not. It wasn't until 9 years after Potts bought his property that he got the idea of making some more money by developing some of it. So he hired the colonial surveyor Nicholas Lightfoot in November of 1761 to come down here and create a town, lay out a road network, you know, designed along the plan of Philadelphia, a grid, and he called that Potts Grove. And so it's not until the end of 1761 that we find him creating that town. And he thought it was admirably suited for commerce, being at the intersection of two main roads, which it was. But commerce at that time was severely constricted because of the infrastructure was so bad. The two main roads were, number one, the road that was called the Great Road that went from Philadelphia and eventually went all the way up to Reading, the city of Reading, which was established in 1752. The other road would be equivalent to what we would call North or South Hanover Street today. It followed the course of Hanover Street sort of through town and would eventually take you up into New Jersey. The only problem was that even though they were good roads for their days, they were very bad roads. They were made out of dirt, and when it rained, they were impassable because they were nothing but mud. And when the weather was dry, they were full of bone-jarring, axle-breaking ruts, and the cost of transportation was therefore very high. Real good commercial development did not start in the United States until the adoption of the canal system in the first decade or so of the 19th century. And the canal came to the Pottstown area in the form of the Schuylkill Navigation Company, which began about 1813, and when it was finally completed, extended all the way to Port Carbon. So when it was done, you could take coal, put it on a canal boat, and much easier take it all the way down to Philadelphia and put it on a ship and send it somewhere or bring it to some of the industries down there. Anything that would fit on a canal boat could be taken through the canal. The only problem with the canal was, in terms of Pottstown, was that it was on the wrong side of the river. So Pottstown commercially benefited very little from the canal's presence. John Potts's village was a very slow grower, and transportation is the reason, and the numbers will tell you that. In 1840, when they took the federal census of 1840, barely 700 people lived in Pottsgrove. And that was a good 80 years after the town had been established. As you can see, there was no growth, no growth. The railroad came in and changed that whole thing. One decade later, in 1850, and a little over 10 years after the railroad had been established, Pottstown's population had jumped to well over 1,600. And following that, when you get 30 years later, in 1880, the 1880 census shows that the population of Pottstown was more than 5,500. So between the 1840 and 1880, significant population growth, and that was due to the railroad. Now, of course, the reason for the railroad saved Pottstown because it came down on Pottstown side of the river. The borough council bribed the railroad. They said, if you will run your line through our town, we'll give you Queen Street. It turned for your right-of-way. This turned out to be a great deal because once that railroad came through Pottstown, that's going to bring people that are going to build factories and mills and that sort of thing in Pottstown because of the railroad access.
So did John Potts build an ironworks in Pottstown?
John Potts, no. He didn't build one in Pottstown. There was a forge up and running. Or, well, let's back that up a minute. He probably had a forge, which had been along the mouth of the Manatawny Creek. The forge that was up and going as early as 1751 was Glasgow Forge, owned by the McCall brothers. And they got the money. I think part of the deal to sell that land to Potts was that his iron mines were going to supply them with iron ore to run their forge.
So was the McCall Forge, is that where Glasgow Street is today?
Yeah, it became Glasgow Ironworks.
And so that was actually in what's today part of the borough of Pottstown,
Yes,
that forge.
yeah.
Okay.
It's the one where Davis's scrapyard used to be.
So after Potts's death, there's not much growth in Pottstown until the railroad comes along, 1840. What were the first industries to grow up in the borough of Pottstown?
The first industries in Pottstown were, as you would expect, connected with iron or with mechanical things. Two of John Potts's descendants created what was known then as the Pottstown Iron Works. And it's hard to think of an ironworks being right in the middle of Pottstown, but it basically was. If you can picture an entire block from Penn Street east to Charlotte and from South Street south to Queen, that was the Pottstown Iron Works. And so it was, in a residential area, and they're making iron. They're rolling iron, they're making nails and this sort of thing.
So, and then what grew up after that? So we had the iron works in the heart of Pottstown.
Also had the railroad. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad made Pottstown one of its early centers. They had a bridge works, which would have been in the area of York Street and High Street. And they also had a car repair shop, which was also in the Charlotte Street area. And it was a big employer. They had about 1,000 men working there.
And so people, obviously the workers were walking to work. It was right in the heart of town. They were living to the north and the west of the works.
It's an interesting story. Some of these guys went as far as lived in North Coventry Township, and they would walk across the bridge. It was nothing for them to walk 5 miles one way to get to the job, and then 5 miles home. So you not only put in your shift which was not an 8-hour shift, but probably more like 10 or 11 hours, 6 days a week, but you walk 10 miles round trip.
Wow. So how did Pottstown, the layout of Pottstown, how did that develop from the initial streets that were laid out by Potts?
Well, Potts had the original town designed on that very logical street grid work that Penn had developed for Philadelphia. And of course, you can't expand to the south because there's the river. So it moved to the east, it moved to the west, and it moved to the north. But keep in mind that it couldn't go that far to the north because until the mid-1880s, the northern boundary of Pottstown was Beach Street. If you lived on the south side of Beach Street, you were in Pottstown. If you walked across the street to visit your friend on the north side of Beach Street, you were going into Pottsgrove Township. And the same thing held true in the east. Pottsgrove Township at the time was much bigger than it is today. Over the years, as Pottstown developed, they just kept gobbling up more and more of Pottsgrove Township. That continued up till the World War II time, 1945. I think was the last addition of Pottsgrove land to Pottstown Borough.
So transportation was basically walking in Pottstown until I guess the trolleys came along.
Until the trolleys came in 1890, if you were going anywhere in Pottstown, it was what they call Shank's Mare. You were walking. Some guys had bicycles. Very few people owned a horse and carriage. That was an expensive proposition. It required a carriage house, it required a stable for the horse, and so on and so forth. Country doctors in Pottstown would definitely have a horse and carriage and a driver, but the average person, the average family in Pottstown got around by walking. That's the way it was. That was the advantage of living in a town like this. You could get wherever you needed to go, you could get there by walking.
And the Main Street Shopping Center, that developed about when? High Street, what we would now call downtown High Street.
Well, downtown High Street, with retail stores, started coming in around sometime around the Civil War, a little bit later. Prior to that, you would have shops, you would have a tailor, you would have somebody who was a carpenter, made finished carpenter who made furniture. You would have people who sold menswear, that sort of thing. They might have brought wholesale, bought from a wholesaler, got here by the canal. But it wasn't until after the Civil War that you start to get the department store concept and the ready-made goods and that sort of thing.
And I believe Whites and Corns is one of the oldest men's clothing stores in the country.
Well, yeah, Whites and Corns is amazingly long-lived. The thing about businesses in the United States is they don't last very long. If you have a business that runs for 50 or 60 years, that's long. Whites and Corn is stretched way beyond that. They're over a century and a half here in Pottstown.
So what were the larger industries that developed in the late 1800s?
Again, what we would call heavy industry. Pottstown Iron Works were down there. There was a bridge works that concentrated on making bridges and delivering them to the site. As the town grew and its industrial capacity needed room to expand, of course you have to keep in mind that the whole key is easy access to the railroad, because that's what's taking things out and bringing raw materials in. So as the industry expands in Pottstown, it's going to be along the river. So once you get the center part of town and towards the eastern part of town filled up, people started moving west of Manatawny Creek, creating ironworks. The Snyder brothers had a boiler works there. And at one time, around the turn of the 20th century, there were so many smokestacks and so much stuff going up into the sky that they called it Death Valley.
Not a very nice term.
Well, if you look at the old maps, some of these graphic drawings, and you see, oh, well, here are the Snyder brothers. They had, if you count them, they've got like 8 smokestacks that go 50 feet up in the air. And next to them is Warwick, and Warwick's got maybe 12, maybe 14, even bigger stacks. And all these stacks are bringing the smoke up. One of the great stories I used to tell about Warwick Iron, and that was leased by a Pottsville company right before World War I. But they were so busy during World War I that it was going 24/7. And they would dump the slag out of those furnaces on the hour. So you could set your watch by just about every hour, dump the slag, and the flames would go shooting up in the air because the stacks were high. And it was something you could see for miles around. It must have been quite a sight.
And what developed out into where Bethlehem Steel, or the former Bethlehem Steel, was located?
Here's the thing about businesses, if the town is lucky. The life of a business in any location is finite. You can have a factory come in and have it do very well for 10, 20, 30 years. But eventually it's going to move or it's going to go out of business. And if you're lucky, somebody moves in and takes that place. And that's what happened in Pottstown for a long time. So you have, like, for instance, the site where Bethlehem Steel started out, or initially, well, no, was a bridge works who had gone into receivership. Two gentlemen who were graduates of Lehigh University, class of 1888, which was William Marshall and Howard McClintock, got financing from Andrew Mellon. Now, Mellon, everybody knows who Mellon was, big financial powerhouse. The Mellon family's from Pittsburgh. Mellon himself was the Secretary of the Treasury under 3 different presidential administrations. Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, and I forget the other guy. But he was there, you know. They lent the Marshall and McClintock, they lent them $150,000 credit, and they were able to establish a steel fabrication plant right here in Pottstown on that site, which would have been at the time west of Kime Street. Industrial highway on the south, at that time was called Water Street. You move west from Kime Street towards Washington Street, that's the area we're talking about. McClintock and Marshall made this a very successful business. By 1915, they were working on $1 million expansion, moving east towards Kime Street and beyond. They had gone from their expansion would require them to hire another 600 employees. So they went from 400 employees to 600 employees. Big increase. And they were getting a lot of really juicy contracts. In 1928, they got the contract to fabricate all the steel for the George Washington Bridge that spans the Hudson River on the north end of New York City. When the Empire State Building was built, they supplied the steel for 1/2 of the floors. They supplied the steel for the locks for the Panama Canal. During the Depression, when everybody else was broke, these people were paying $8 million in dividends a year. It was a very attractive industry, extremely successful, one of the biggest prefabricating plants in the United States. And everybody that was employed here was from the Pottstown area. Along comes Bethlehem Steel, who needed something like this to help them compete with the other steel companies in the country. They acquired McClintock Marshall in 1931. And that was the same year that the fantastic contract came through for the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. All the steel on the bridge and in the towers was prefabricated here in Pottstown, sent by train down to Philadelphia, put on boat down the Atlantic Ocean, through the Panama Canal, and back up to San Francisco. It wasn't until 1936 that Bethlehem Steel officially changed the name of Marshall McClintock to the Bethlehem Steel Prefabrication Company.
So as the industries are burgeoning, so is our population, town population. People have to find places to live. And now the trolleys come along. You want to talk about the trolley lines and where they went and what opened up in Pottstown as a result of that?
Well, the trolleys were interesting because they came about as not as to provide public transportation, but as a means of getting the public to a theme park that the investors own. In both instances, Saratoga came first, and the trolley line went, its eastern terminus was Saratoga Park.
And this was along High Street?
Yeah, it went along High Street. And then, not too long after that, another trolley line came in, and they pretty much went north and south through the borough with the idea of getting up to Ringing Rocks, the theme park, the fun place that they owned. So that was the idea. Eventually, there were some more trolley lines came through the borough, But the initial impetus there was not to provide public transportation for folks to get from one point to another, but to get them to the park that they own. Now, did they provide a means that you could go from, let's say, Whale and West High Street to, let's say, High and Kime Street on the trolley? Sure you could. But where they made their money was hauling those people out to the park. So they benefited, the company, the trolley made them money, and their park made them money. It was a good investment for them, and it was a good thing for Pottstown.
But it enabled people now to commute a longer distance by getting on the trolley into the downtown Pottstown where the jobs were.
That's right. If you lived out in Sanatoga, you could get a trolley into town. I remember talking to Elsie Huff, whose father owned a stone quarry out there in Sanatoga. And Elsie's up in her 90s now, and she told me when she went to high school, they used to ride the trolley.
So the development of North Pottstown and the development of East Pottstown was enabled through the trolley system that was built.
Oh, the trolleys helped, definitely.
And did we have anything that might be considered within the borough of Pottstown that might be considered to be a car suburb when people started then driving cars?
Well, I've never thought about that. Within the Pottstown borough, well, the whole north end, after World War II, when that started to develop, and you get as far up, you know, as Hanover and Mervine Street, and you have a job downtown, if you can't get a bus, you're certainly going to want to have an automobile to get back and forth to work.
So let's talk about Pottstown cemeteries. What was the first major cemetery in Pottstown?
Well, initially, the major cemeteries were all connected with the churches. So along Hanover Street, where you had the Lutheran and Reformed congregations, that whole area in there would have been the east side of Hanover became a graveyard. And there were burials in there from the 1770s all the way up into the middle of the 19th century, if not further. Huge area, absolutely huge. And you find in the country, for instance, New Hanover Lutheran Church, the oldest Lutheran church in continuous use in the United States. Their graveyard is massive, absolutely massive. But eventually, by the time you get to the mid-19th century, people are getting away from burying at the church, and you're getting the idea of a cemetery standing alone concept. And in Pottstown, you have the establishment of the Pottstown Cemetery, and that was in the 1850s. And that thing grew. One of the things that helped it to grow was the churches started to expand, the churches where the cemetery was, and they needed that land. And so a lot of families, they were just having mass disinterments and reburials. And they would be reburied in the Pottstown Cemetery. A lot of them were buried there.
And the Pottstown Cemetery was located where? From where to where?
At that time, Pottstown Cemetery was between Hanover and Charlotte Street, as far north as Jefferson. And eventually, as that became filled up, they expanded to the west side of Hanover all the way up to York Street.
So that was the first major cemetery in Pottstown.
Yes.
And then I guess the next one was Edgewood.
Edgewood came along about the same time, and at that time that was far out of town. That wasn't even in Pottstown, that was in Lower Pottsgrove Township. And that got it off, and Edgewood has never been a very big cemetery. It's not anywhere near the size, for instance, of the Pottstown Cemetery, or if you cross the river, go to Mount Zion in North Coventry Township. There is always the neat thing about cemeteries is it's a great way to walk through a cemetery, get a name and some dates off the tombstone. You can do some research on whoever that is and get a little bit of an idea of what their life was like. And it's just fascinating. It gives you insight into that person's family in particular, into a whole era in general. And we hate to see them fading away, but the fact is that Over 60% of the people that are being some kind of funeral these days are being cremated.
So
no,
who are
where?
some of the famous people who are?
In our cemeteries?
Yeah.
Well, in Edgewood, we have Annie Wittenmeyer, who was extremely well known because of the work she did in the Civil War as a nurse and developing diet kitchens as a way of getting decent food to wounded soldiers. She was so well known that she was a personal acquaintance of Abraham Lincoln, U.S. Grant, his wife Julia Dent Grant, and William Sherman. She, after the war, came to Philadelphia and was heavily involved in the Women's Christians Temperance Union, and eventually moved out to Saratoga. And the house sits there, it's still there on the hill, not too far away from Hilltop Drive-In. She's buried there. There's a Rear Admiral, the United States Navy, whose name right now escapes me, unfortunately, but he was a Pottstown guy and graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy. And his stone is there, along with his family, but he's not. He was cremated, and his remains were scattered over the Gulf of Mexico because he lived in that section of Florida.
And some other famous Pottstownians, regardless of where they're buried?
Famous Pottstownians, my mind tends to run along the military history thing. I can tell you, for instance, that John Rudder Brooke, who cut his eye teeth in the Civil War with became the commander of a regiment without any previous experience, went on to become the second-ranking Major General in the United States Army, and during the Mexican or Spanish-American War was military governor of Cuba and Puerto Rico. He died in 1926 and is buried in Arlington. Al Gray, the great jazz trombone player, who grew up here in Pottstown and went on to become very famous, played with a lot of big bands, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, was a personal favorite of Frank Sinatra's. I don't know where Al's buried, but it's not in Pottstown.
How about Amanda Smith? Tell us a little bit about the Smith family.
Yeah, well, Amanda Smith is, what I know, I know little about this. She was a widow, had some children, and apparently was very good at baking pies. And her son Robert was quite the entrepreneur. And these pies were so good that he used to work, I believe he ran the restaurant or whatever you would call it in the YMCA, and would bring his mother's pies in, and they would be gone in a heartbeat. Robert thought, wow, these pies are so great. He just fixed up the back seat of his car so he could carry a lot of pies around, and went around trying to sell them to local merchants. And it was a great product, so people bought them. The merchants bought them because people wanted them. And that business grew from there. Where she's buried? Probably in Mount Zion. You see, there's also a hierarchy of cemeteries. If you were of the upper crust, let's say, you know, you were involved with it. Pottstown had an aristocracy, and they were buried at Edgewood. The average citizen was buried in the Pottstown Cemetery. And then when the cemetery across the river got started, a lot of people who wanted to be in a little bit better neighborhood when they died, a little bit more Tony, they bought lots over there. So you see a lot of late 19th century, early 20th century successful businessmen and that sort of thing buried across the river at Mount Zion, but who are really Pottstown people.
And what would you say was the apogee of Pottstown? What decades were our best decades in history?
Well, I'd say the borough, if you want to talk about economic well-being, the borough reached its apogee in the 1960s. Major industries were still here, and they were paying fantastic wages. For instance, at Firestone, these guys that worked on the line building tires, they were making in excess of $20 an hour. They had medical plans, they had dental plans, and that sort of thing. When Firestone built its first tires here in Pottstown in March of 1944, they were getting paid 70 cents a week. So you fast forward 20 years and their pay is astronomical. Bethlehem Steel was the same way, making tremendous amount of money. Bethlehem Steel was destroyed, or what, the prefabrication plants were destroyed by what am I talking about? It was destroyed by the project that became the World Trade Center in Manhattan. New Jersey and New York Port of Authorities were in charge of financing that job, overseeing the job. The lowest bid to come in on the job was from Bethlehem Steel. But somewhere, somebody got the bright idea of it would be much cheaper, instead of building this job out total, that we build it out in pieces. And so that's what they did. And so by getting some smaller company could handle just one piece of the job, you handle this piece, you handle that piece, and the sum of those pieces comes out to a lot less than the total that Bethlehem Steel had put in, even though Bethlehem Steel was the lowest bidder for the whole job. The result was Bethlehem Steel did not get that job. The management of Bethlehem Steel saw the handwriting on the wall, and they went back to the union and asked them to take a pay cut. The best the union could do for them was, well, the union said, I'll tell you what, we'll take a reduction in our dental plan. When they found that out, that was the union's last response. Bethlehem Steel said, that's it, we're going out of the prefab business, sell them all. So that's what brought on the demise of the prefab business here in Pottstown. That's not to say it would still be here now, but it closed down in '76. It might have lasted longer.